I would like to welcome you all to our lecture series on the Middle East after October 7th. We are tonight actually, very glad and honored to have Dr. Ziad Bahaa Eldin uh, uh, to give a lecture on Egyptian foreign policy after October 7th. And we are very honored because Dr. Bahaa-Eldin is not only a very important person in terms of economics and economic activity, but he has been the deputy prime minister of Egypt, and he has been involved in politics. So he can give us both the view of an economist, the politician, and the political analyst at the same time, which is it's unique. We talked before and we said that we are in a way very glad that we have the voice of Egypt in this lecture series, because I believe, it's my view, that Egypt is always at the center, even at times when other regions are taking the lead. But Egypt is always at the center. Nobody can do anything without Egypt, particularly in terms of what we call the core of Middle East politics. So without further ado, I would like to uh, invite Dr. Bahaa-Eldin to take the floor and give us what I believe would be a most interesting lecture.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me and see me reasonably well. I'm really delighted and honored to be invited by the Center for Mediterranean, Middle East and Islamic Studies. It's a great honor, and it opens up for me an avenue to talk to colleagues and hopefully friends from this beautiful country, as well as from various people who are interested in the Middle East from your perspective. So thank you, Professor Roussos. Thank you, Stavros and Zakia, and thank you all for attending. I'm not going to speak too long, because I understand that there should be a Q&A opportunity afterwards, and I think that it would be nice if we make this as interactive as possible, and I'll be very happy to take questions afterwards. So let me say that I am, as you heard, I'm a lawyer. I'm a former politician in Egypt and member of parliament, former. I'm a lawyer now. I'm a political writer, but I'm not in the government. I have not been for a while. I'm an independent commentator and have been for the last 10 years. And therefore, I do not necessarily or not at all reflect the point of view of the Egyptian government or authorities, but rather I speak to you as an observer and someone who lives in Egypt and has lived in Egypt all my life. And therefore, I hope to bring to you how things are seen from the Egyptian side. I will speak about foreign relations and about the situation with respect to Gaza, not only after October 7th, but obviously after the very dramatic events of the last week. So when I agreed with the center to have this chat with you today, a lot has happened since then, believe it or not, in the last 3 weeks. We're still living in the aftermath of the collapse of the Syrian regime. I think that is one of the most dramatic moments that we have seen in the region in a very long time, and the ramifications and outcomes of this change of the regime in Syria, which we do not yet know fully, but will undoubtedly be extremely important and far-reaching. And I'm happy to come back to that in a bit. But we've seen also the presidential elections finally take place in Lebanon A new president is there. A new prime minister has been elected. There is some hope that Lebanon will be back on a track of rebuilding itself under the new regime. There is, of course, the most important thing is the ceasefire in Gaza, which hopefully will hold and will turn into something even more enduring and more effective on the long term, so that we can all begin to turn our minds and our resources towards the very urgent needs of reconstruction in Gaza following the total destruction that has taken place over the last year and a half. And of course, we are all looking at the new Trump administration back in power. It is coming back with a lot of vigor, with a lot of strength, I should say with a lot of anger as well. I watched the speech of inauguration and I found it quite astonishing in the clarity and radicalism of the positions that the new president intends to take both internally and externally. And I don't mean that necessarily in a good way, to be honest. I'm quite worried. So a lot has happened only in the last couple of weeks. But all eyes right now on the ceasefire efforts in Gaza. It's way too late. The cost has been enormous. The cost has been unprecedented on human lives, on people, on their futures, on their infrastructure, on their lives. And it's great that it happens at the end, but obviously it was way overdue and should have occurred many, many months before then. So all eyes are now on the prospects for Gaza, and I will talk a little bit about what I feel are the preconditions for a successful reconstruction or beginning even of rehabilitation and reconstruction of Gaza. But before doing so, let me clarify two things. First of all, what is Egypt's position, formal position? What has Egypt's formal position been with respect to the war on Gaza? And what has the sentiment of Egyptian people also been throughout the last year and a half? On the Egyptian government, the official position is very clear. There is unwavering support for the Palestinian cause and for what the Egyptian government considers to be the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. There has been support, both humanitarian as well as diplomatic, to the Palestinian people in Gaza. But it's important to know that official Egypt deals with Hamas with a lot of caution, has been dealing with caution from the outset, because for a few years, Hamas and Egypt have not been on very good terms, and therefore some suspicion has remained even as Hamas was involved in the confrontation with Israel. There is unwavered condemnation of Israeli violence during that war. But on the other hand, there is a continuous refusal of any proposal of mass Palestinian migration or deportation into Egypt. This is something that the Egyptian government maintains for two reasons. The first one is because Egypt does not want to be involved in a project that leads to the what we call the liquidation or the termination of the Palestinian rights over the territory of Gaza and other human rights for Palestinians on their territory. And therefore, Egypt does not want to be part of a project that leads to the emptying of Gaza and the end of Palestinian rights to their land. In addition, it has also to be admitted that there are other concerns about a mass movement of Palestinian population into Egypt. How will Egypt handle this? How will they be supported? What kind of life will they have? Would it be in an enclave dedicated to migrants or spread around the whole country? So all of these are concerns, but as I said, Egypt's position has been no to the mass deportation of Palestinians across the border. The Egyptian people, on the other hand, and I think that has been the case from the outset, and I have to say, in spite of some significant worry and even by a lot of people, condemnation of the October 7th initial start of events, initial attack by the Palestinian side, but the overwhelming and totally unbalanced response by Israel has made the vast majority, I cannot say all of the Egyptian people, because nobody can really claim to know the minds of all the Egyptian people, but there is no doubt that the more than overwhelming majority of Egyptian people have been totally sympathetic and supportive of the Palestinian side in this very damaging war. Now we come to a point of possible recovery. And I'm a personal believer that no matter what the losses have been, no matter what the tragedy has been, as soon as an opportunity presents itself for a ceasefire, for the reconstruction, for and even for peacemaking to occur in the region, we cannot miss that opportunity, and it has to be taken wholeheartedly. But let me say a few words about the challenges of reconstruction in Gaza if the current ceasefire continues and develops into something more enduring. Because Egypt will have a very important role to play in any future reconstruction, but that reconstruction will not happen just because some countries will come together during a conference like they do from time to time and say, here is the donors conference for Palestine or for Gaza. Let's pour a lot of billions of dollars and see how this will work out. It will not work out like this. Money is critical in this coming phase, but it is not the only element, and it may not even be the most important element. There are other, what I call preconditions for the possible comeback to a road of recovery with the Palestinians in Gaza. And I would mention 6 preconditions other than the money. The money is there, but there are other 6 preconditions. One of them, perhaps the first one, is that an enduring ceasefire has to take place. No reconstruction can begin to happen or will have any momentum if this happens while Israel continues to bomb civilian targets and to target various people and various entities. There has to be an enduring and a credible ceasefire that really sticks for a while, so that everybody involved has a feeling that this is for real and this will continue. Number 2, there has to be a credible plan of reconstruction. And a credible plan of reconstruction is very different from a humanitarian plan. A humanitarian plan has got to be the first phase of any intervention. You need at the first phase to enter quickly to begin to reconstruct health services, education services, some infrastructure and housing, obviously, as well as electricity, water, and all of that. This has got to be phase 1. But that is not a plan of reconstruction. A plan of reconstruction has to be followed by a resumption of some employment generation, and it has to also be built in a way that leads to an economic recovery plan based on an understanding of the resources and conditions in Gaza, and a proper economic analysis of competitiveness, of what kind of infrastructure is needed, which industries can be recreated in this small, relatively small piece of land. Does it need an airport? Does it need a port? Does it have the right infrastructure? What industries to encourage? What kind of incentives are needed for people to start carrying on ordinary lives, and so on. So a credible plan of reconstruction has to be in place. A big problem is going to be having a credible political counterpart with which every party can negotiate, or parties can negotiate. There is going to be a very difficult situation, because to think of the Palestinian Authority to just come back to the scene and negotiate on behalf of the Palestinians in the same way that it had been doing for the last few years before October 7th, I think is something that everybody recognizes is no longer tenable. There's got to be something else. Perhaps the Palestinian Authority will continue to have a role to play. It does have the people, the expertise, the bureaucratic infrastructure, but there is no doubt that a lot of credibility has been lost on the side of the Palestinian Authority. There is, of course, Hamas has been in government before and is no doubt the dominant political force, if not the only political force that can now speak for the Palestinians. It has been negotiating with Israel in the last round of discussions. So, the problem of finding the right political counterpart with which the whole world can negotiate is going to be very important. We also need to think, in the modern world, you don't think of reconstruction as just building hospitals and schools and pipes and electricity. There is a soft infrastructure, and that too has to be thought about. What kind of regulatory system in place, what kind of laws and regulations, what kind of IT infrastructure, what kind of systems. This is, again, very important. There will be a need for international organizations to step in and to provide a huge amount of support. And I'm afraid to say, and that is not something that I say about the Gaza alone, but it's true everywhere in the world and everywhere in the Arab world. There has to be, one of the reasons why we need international organizations' presence is that there has to be supervision on the spending. The people have to be the beneficiaries of all of this have to be convinced that any program for reconstruction is not going to be, quote unquote, stolen by corruption or mismanagement or lack of governance or lack of systems. There has to be credibility in the spending. And then the money has to be there. So as I said, the money is obviously important, but it's very, very critical to not think, as we saw in the past, a conference to reconstruct Libya, a conference to reconstruct Yemen, a conference to reconstruct Lebanon at different times. Sudan, of course, none of this will have results unless those 5 or 6 preconditions are in place. I finally conclude by saying, where does Egypt stand in terms of foreign policy? So where does this fit? I explained a little bit how the Egyptian government and the Egyptian people view the situation in Palestine and in Gaza and how they react to the events. But to understand Egypt's view and place in the broader Middle East, in general and in the world at large, I would just say that rather than comment on Egypt's relationships with various countries, perhaps the best thing to tell you is to try to share with you what are the key determinants of Egypt's foreign policy rather than just describe specific cases. So in other words, what are the points of interest? What are the issues that drive Egyptian foreign policy and have driven it for the last few years? And here I would like to mention some of them, and that will be my last point before concluding. The determinants of Egypt's foreign policy, in my mind, are various. Number one, and I may surprise you by saying this, number one is the economy. The economy in Egypt over the last 6-7 years, but particularly in the last 2 to 3 years, has gone through a difficult time. We have endured what I think is fair to describe as economic crisis, especially last year and the year before. Inflation had been running at around anywhere between 25 to 30% for 3 consecutive years. There has been an outflow of money going abroad rather than an inflow. Although officially not too high, but there is recognition that a lot of unemployment is taking place. The basic services and infrastructure has seen a deterioration, especially outside of the new cities and the new projects being built. And so all of this came to a head in 2023 with a currency crisis, a terrible economic crisis that we managed to come out of mainly as a result of the rest of the world stepping in a program, a huge grant by the European Union, massive investments by investors from the Gulf, particularly from the United Arab. So we managed to avert what could have been a really terrible crisis. This, I think, is the biggest driver of economic foreign policy, that Egypt has to ensure that it is bridges with partners that can be part of an economic recovery plan. So that's one. The other determinant is that while Egypt will always support the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian rights, Egypt considers its peace agreement with Israel, the Camp David agreement, since the late 70s, to be the cornerstone of peace in the Middle East, and therefore there has been, and I think will continue to be, full commitment by Egypt to peace with Israel. Number three, big priority for Egypt's foreign policy is to be in the side that is combating terrorism in the region. We have suffered greatly from terrorism maybe 7-8 years ago for 2 to 3 years consecutively. There has been great losses of lives, of economy, of tourism revenues, of many things, and therefore Egypt is fully committed in its foreign policy to align itself with countries that are equally combating terrorism. Number four, and very important and peculiar to Egypt in that case, is that, as you already know, we have had issues with the use of the Nile water. The Nile, of course, is the river that runs from within 9 African countries, and it ends in Egypt. Just before Egypt, it goes through Sudan, and in Ethiopia, that has been a building of a massive dam. And Egypt has been very worrying and very concerned about the Ethiopian plans to limit or to control the flow of water, and therefore that has become part of a very fundamental part of Egypt's foreign policy to secure support for its water demands. Number five is that Egypt has two very critical borders with Libya and with Sudan, two countries that have been in turmoil for many years now. Libya perhaps less in the news, but continues to be divided between a government in the east and a government in the west. Egypt is aligned to the government in the east, but although there has been no open hostilities or confrontation, but still Libya continues to be a challenge for Egypt. The much bigger challenge, of course, is Sudan. Sudan is really the forgotten tragedy of the Middle East now. The amount of horror, of famine, of disease, of deprivation, and of displacement that has occurred in Sudan, while the world has been busy with other issues, is really quite disturbing, to say the least. And Sudan has to continue to be on top of Egypt's worries. We have a very large number of Sudanese refugees in Egypt. They are extremely welcome from time to time. I'm sure you know, everywhere in the world, there are voices that will say, you know, they're here, they're taking our jobs, they're taking our resources. But I think that on the whole, the Sudanese living in Egypt have been more than welcome and completely integrated. Especially that they're not all refugees from the latest round of violence in Sudan. They have been coming into Egypt over the last 30 to 40 years, but the situation in Sudan has gotten to a catastrophic extent, and very important to shed light on it at some one point. My 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, seventh point is that Egypt continues to play and to make sure that it plays a role as a peacemaker and a regional power. As you saw, the latest round of discussions that took place and led to the ceasefire in Gaza have been attributed to Qatar, Egypt, and USA efforts, and I think Egypt will continue and wants to continue to play that key role as a peacemaker. We may not have the resources that other countries have, but I think Egypt benefits here from a very deep and mature diplomatic tradition and diplomatic service that is often very helpful in those situations. The eighth element in our foreign policy is that Egypt more recently has become very interested in promoting and being part of a new energy hub that would include particularly Greece and Cyprus, and that is increasing becoming important in our foreign policy priorities. And last thing I want to say about key determinants in our foreign policy is that while Egypt will continue to maintain strong ties with the USA and Europe, and they will continue to be its primary international allies, it has over the last few years continued to try and diverse its relationships and presence. And perhaps the clearest example of this is Egypt joining the BRICS alliance about a year ago. And not just as alliance, but with various members of BRICS, Egypt has been quite active with Brazil, with India, with China, and even with Russia, as the Ukraine war has been going on. So it is not looking at BRICS or at any of those countries as an alternative or a competitor to its relationship with US and in Europe, but there is certainly a sense of need for diversification and for opening other venues and channels. I said I would not speak too long, but I hope I have not really gone above what is, I was telling our colleagues here, somebody should stop me. I was member of parliament in Egypt for some time, and I have the capability of speaking for many hours unless somebody pulls the plug. So I will not wait until somebody pulls the plug. I will just stop here and hope to hear
it was so
any
interesting what
questions from you.
No, it was so interesting. I was so much delighted to hear you, and no problem. Well, I'll take the privilege of being the first to just bring to you not some questions. Well, I would like to talk more about the two countries, the two states that are not Arab states, but they are playing a very big role in what's happening now in the Middle East, and in Middle East in general, in history. I'm talking about Turkey and Iran. And I would like to hear your comment and your analysis about the relations between Egypt and Turkey, and on the other hand, how is Iran viewed by in Cairo? I mean, how the Egyptians view Iran? I know that there's no particular antagonism between Egypt and Iran, or a particular close relations between these two countries, but I'm sure that there is a kind of analysis of how Cairo is looking the current situation in Iran. And this is going to bring me to the second, which is to another thing, which is the situation in Syria. You said at the beginning that Syria is quite a big moment, a great moment for the Middle East, which is very important, and I'm sharing with you as well. You say that the determinants one of the determinants in Egyptian foreign policy is the combat against terrorism. And how then the current Egyptian government is looking towards the Syrian situation, taking into the account that the President Al-Sisi has started to, in a way, trying to integrate Syria and Bashar al-Assad into what they call the Arab order. What's your views about it?
Sure. Let me start with Syria, because that will impact a lot Iran and Turkey. So I think it's a huge development. It's a big moment in the Middle East. Although I have my worries like everybody else does. So I'm not saying it, frankly, necessarily entirely optimistically. I think there is a lot to worry about in what is going on in Syria. And but in all cases, I think it will have a huge impact. So let me start by saying that it's difficult not to be happy that the Syrian regime of Hafez al-Assad has collapsed. It's difficult not to find this in itself an extremely positive development, because among all the dictatorships of the Middle East, among all of the tough regimes in that area, I think the Syrian regime was one of the worst. And the level of violence and that it has committed against its own people, I don't think is matched by any other regime recently. So it's difficult not to consider the collapse of the Assad family regime in itself a good thing. I think it is a good thing. The problem is that what comes in its place is, first of all, not clear, not sufficiently known, a lot of question marks. And on the other hand, there are signs that are worrying, in spite the fact that that new regime, and especially its leader, has been talking very wisely, very intelligently, projecting a lot of good image, talking the right talk, as they say. But it's difficult to just forget that this regime whose roots are coming out of Al-Qaeda and are coming out of very violent groups, armed groups. So that put Egypt in a bit of a spot, because although Egypt was not that close to Bashar al-Assad and his regime, and therefore I don't think had a big issue with the collapse of that regime, I think there were, as far as Egypt is concerned, some positive elements and some negative elements. On the positive side, the decline, what the collapse of the Assad regime has indicated as a sign of decline of Iran's influence has been very welcomed by Egypt. Egypt does not mind seeing Iran's influence decline, and does not mind seeing the influence of Hezbollah in Lebanon also decline. So that, in a way, was the positive outcome of the collapse of the Assad regime. Another perhaps minor element is that we also have in Egypt a large number of Syrian refugees who are equally welcome and who are very productive and economic. But, you know, in a way, any resolution of the Syrian situation will allow a lot of Syrians to go back home and get out of that status of refugees. So these are on the positive side. On the negative side, there are very big worries. First one is that as much as that has indicated the decline of the Iranian influence, it has indicated to the whole world the rise of the Turkish influence over Syria, and that is something that worries Egypt, I think. More importantly, it has allowed the resurface of another attempt at letting an Islamic regime kind of take over and submit a an Islamic alternative, if you like, to governing an important Arab country. And that immediately raises alarm bells everywhere in the region on whether this will tempt other, activists, other radical groups, other political parties and Islamic parties to kind of find that the opportunity is rising up once again to become part of the political process. Also, on the negative side for Egypt is what we call in economics the demonstration effect, that it looks like Syria can succeed by toppling the regime and adopting a new attitude. And finally, Egypt, I think, worries about Syria becoming a center or a base for radical Islam now that Turkey has kind of given up that role and Qatar has given up that role about 2 years ago. So the worry is that Syria will become the center or the hub for radical Islam to begin to be organized and active again. So on the whole, I think there is a lot to worry about, but I do not at all undermine the importance of the change in Syria. I think, as I said, it will have long-term effects, long-term repercussions. A lot of it will depend on how the new regime in Syria will behave. Will they really manage to show and to prove that they are able of modernizing and getting out of their violent terrorist background? Or is this just something temporary and we will fall back in the same place? I don't want to speak for too long, but I think I've indicated in a way that Egypt is cautious both about Iran and about Turkey, although in very different ways. Iran continues to be, as far as Egypt is concerned, a radical, possibly violent country that is willing and has shown in the past its capacity to export disturbance and violence and instability in countries around the region, and therefore a lot of suspicion continues towards Iran. But you need to appreciate that Egypt is not part of the Sunni-Shia divide. We are not a country where that tension has ever existed, and so the disagreement with Iran is purely political. It is not deep-rooted and ethnic or religious in the way that you find it perhaps in the Gulf or in Lebanon or in Syria. There isn't that historical dimension of Sunni versus Shia. Egypt is a Sunni country. The tension with Shia has never been part of our discourse or part of our worry. It is purely political, and it is purely based on Iran's political activities and decisions. As for Turkey, until 2 years ago, relationships with Turkey, between Turkey and Egypt, was terrible. The main driver of this was the Turkish government's alignment on the side of the Muslim Brotherhood once the Muslim Brotherhood regime collapsed in Egypt in 2013. And for almost 7-8 years afterwards, Turkey continued to be the main advocate of defending and promoting the Muslim Brotherhood's activities in the region, including in Egypt. That only came to an end about 2 years ago with a lot of diplomatic efforts on various parts, including from Gulf countries, which led to Turkey finally giving up that wholehearted support for the Muslim Brotherhood, and Egypt embracing again once more relationships with Turkey. But again, it's still new. I think there is a lot of lost trust between the two sides. It will take much more than this to rebuild full trustworthy relationships between Egypt and Turkey, but it looks like it's progressing. And mind you, that is not the only point of contention, and that's very important in understanding Turkey. It's not just the Muslim Brotherhood's, Turkey's support of the Muslim Brotherhood. There are other elements. There is the Turkish intervention in Libya, which reached a point where Turkey had some militias attached to the Turkish army based in Libya, and that is something that for Egypt constituted a huge breach of national security. There is some competition over the energy hub, where Egypt is trying to build that tripartite relationship with Greece and Cyprus. Obviously, Turkey needs to find its place in that situation. So it's not just political, it's not just the Muslim Brotherhood. There are some other economic and geopolitical considerations to make Egypt and Turkey resume relationships, perhaps. But there is, I think, it will take time to regain a full trust with the situation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm
So,
gonna go
Zaki
with,
and Stavros, you can handle the floor now.
okay, thank you, Mr. Roussos. I think we're reaching to the end, like we're heading an hour very time soon. So I would like to, not ask all the questions, but a couple. You allow me a couple. And I'll mainly focus on the moving of the Arab center, let's put it this way, and mostly financial center, which is from Egypt, which was, for many decades, the center of the Arab world, to the Gulf. Unlike the past, Egypt is not tending to find alliances in its immediate borders or with, countries that are in the near its borders. But we've seen various attempts in the Gulf. And while we see particularly, I feel like there is, of course, caution. I think it was one of the most amazing points you made. I've never realized, but you put it very well, how cautious Egypt is. I think much more than ever within the region. I mean, having to deal with all this in the African continent, but also in in Western Asia, also in the Middle East. I find it very hard to understand how has it not find its place in the Gulf dynamics. If I'm not mistaken, one of the main actors that assisted the Egyptian-Turkish relations was Saudi Arabia. And many analysts at the time thought that there would be a new triangle of Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia emerging in the face of countering emerging powers in the region, particularly the Emirates. So I find that it kind of like blew over. I feel like it's really hard to navigate or understand or canvas Egypt's approach in the Gulf, because there is a lot for Egypt in the Gulf. And particularly with Saudi Arabia, like what is that alliance looking like? Is there an opportunity there to counter various, efforts? Because contrary to the past, the region seems to be embracing something scholars call minilateralism, small, fast, and to the point agreements to reach certain goals of common interests. Egypt has been almost everywhere, however, has not been able to find a place where it could be able to, absorb all this fruits from this minilateral agreements. And it's very important for Egypt because, as you said, the financial problems of Egypt at this moment is very much to the detriment of its political power. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Zakia. You're asking many things in what looks like one question. So let me try to divide it a little bit by saying the following. I'll start from 2 points. Point number one, let's not put all the Gulf countries together, because there are huge differences between and the other, not only the obvious ones, but I mean especially with in regard to the relationship with Egypt, and therefore I want to comment on 4 of them separately, because it's a different story with each one of them. But the other broad remark I want to say, I think that it's very important for us Egyptians and for people in the Gulf, by the way, to, as much as possible, avoid falling in a discourse of competition between Egypt and the Gulf. Yes, Egypt has been the center of education and culture and art and films and music and lawmaking and engineers and architects for the last 200 years, since the beginning of the Renaissance 200 years ago. But life develops and life goes in different directions, and there is a huge revival taking place in the Gulf and has been taking place in the Gulf for the last 40 years. And therefore, if we all fall into that sense of competition, are we better because we were, we have a stronger history, or are you better because you have a better opportunity in the future, then it's a lose-lose situation. There is a lot of complementarity, and there is an extremely important need for those who are conscious of these issues, for politicians, for writers, for people who influence public opinion, to try to avoid falling into that, frankly, silly competitiveness that sometimes reaches very ugly levels, I'm talking at the social media, kind of thing. To give you an example of what I mean by complementarity, between Egypt and Saudi Arabia in particular, and I'll talk about Saudi Arabia, there are at least, and there are no not accurate official statistics, there are at least 2 to 2.5 years working in Saudi Arabia. If you multiply that by an average number of family members of 4 to 5, then you're talking about 15% of Egyptians totally dependent on work in Saudi Arabia. That's very important for Egypt, extremely important. But it doesn't mean that it's one-way relationship, because in the same way, you can imagine how much Saudi Arabia is dependent on labor force coming out of Egypt, and it is not labor force that is as easily replaceable by others, because there are issues of culture, of language, of familiarity. And so we have to look at those issues as I said, as complementary things. Now, I'll come back to my first point. Let's divide the Gulf into 4 main countries. Kuwait is very important, but Kuwait, frankly, has its own internal problems, its own political problems, the change of governments very frequently, parliamentary elections almost every year, families competing for power, issues of corruption. Kuwait has been the first country in the Gulf to modernize and to introduce modern education and modern science, but it has lagged behind because mainly after the Iraqi invasion 20 years ago. But since that time, it has had its own internal political deadlock. So Kuwait, we can, kind of put it aside for the time being. Qatar had a terribly bad relationship with Egypt until very recently. Again, driven primarily by Qatar's willingness to host and to promote the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood following the collapse of the regime in 2013. And that has only changed about 2 years ago. Until then, Egypt and Qatar were at complete loggerheads. However, it's important to recognize that Qatar, during that time, and I think it's fair to say so, that Qatar during that time has allowed Egyptians to continue to work in Qatar and to work normally and to have their full rights and respect. And this is something that I think Egypt should acknowledge and be grateful for, that Qatar did not allow the political disagreement to step into the lives of ordinary Egyptians working there and making livelihoods. Now we come to the bigger 2 countries. UAE has been Egypt's strongest supporter in the post-Muslim Brotherhood transition. It is the country that has stepped up to the responsibility of helping Egypt out after 2013 more than any other country in the region. And I think that this is something that Egypt will continue to credit the UAE for. It has also stepped up in a different way last year at the height of the economic crisis that I described at the beginning. other than the IMF program and the EU loan, it was UAE investments that frankly saved the Egyptian economy from a very terrible situation. So but there are disagreements with UAE, and that's interesting to see. Egypt and UAE have had disagreements, particularly over the UAE's foreign policy with respect to Ethiopia, to Sudan, and to Libya. On those three countries, Egypt and UAE have not been on the same side at all. But as I said, UAE has stepped into and helped Egypt twice at the most critical crises. Finally, Saudi Arabia, I have no doubt that the most important ally for Egypt on the long term will have to be Saudi Arabia. This is the country with the size, the population, the depth, the capability to absorb Egyptians working abroad in numbers that no other country can match. A huge infrastructure needs to be built that will need resources and companies and machines and expertise. And there are big borders between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, big strategic cooperation that has to be developed. And this is the country that Egypt has to be very careful in building the right relationship with. And as I said, we should not allow the language of competition, the language of superiority, the language of frankly verging on racism to occur neither here on this side nor on that side. Your initial question was, is there a scenario for an Egypt, Saudi, Turkish kind of global alliance in the region? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that the most we can hope is to have good economic relationships with Turkey, good respect of not intervening in each other's affairs, but I don't think that there would be an alliance in that sense at all. I hope to see an Arab-Saudi improvement of relationships and good relationships with Turkey, but I don't see an axis forming in the way that you asked.
Zakia, if you're saying something, we can't hear you.
We cannot hear Zakia. Stavros, you can take over.
Yeah, so it was a very interesting presentation. In the past half hour, you managed to answer all the questions I had. So thank you for that. But I have a follow-up question on Turkish-Egyptian relations. You mentioned the reasons behind the rapprochement from the Turkish side and how Turkey, let's say, stepped away from its relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on the Egyptian priorities behind the rapprochement with Turkey. You mentioned briefly Libya and the fact that Egypt is cautious with relation to Turkey. But what are the other priorities of Egypt towards Turkey? Because we see reports for economic deals for Egypt buying up military equipment from Turkey. And also many reports with regard to the great Ethiopian dam, Renaissance Dam, and how Turkey could perhaps mediate between Egypt and Ethiopia. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you're right in pointing out to elements outside of the Muslim Brotherhood disagreement that we had for many years. The main reason for rapprochement that I see between the two sides is economic. For Egypt, Turkey has become the closest to the model of economic development that we sometimes like to compare ourselves or to hope to aspire. I'm talking particularly in terms of the growth of the tourism industry in Turkey, I know that Greece has done fantastically well, but you know, Turkey is equally extremely successful in that regard. Turkish industry has been doing extremely well. Turkey has, in spite of economic turmoil and in spite of a fluctuating currency and an often deteriorating balance of payments from time to time, Turkey has managed much more than Egypt to keep the market in a way functioning as a market in spite of political disagreement and political intervention in other matters. So for many of these things, Egypt sees Turkey as an important economic ally. Now, in the last year in particular, we have had a massive devaluation of the Egyptian pound. I think now it must be about a year and a half ago. The currency, following 3 devaluations, lost almost 60% of its value. And that has made Egypt extremely competitive for relocating industries from more expensive economies. And we have already seen the influx of interest from Turkish businesses in textile, in food production, in some electrical commodities, in car parts manufacturing, in machines manufacturing, in boat manufacturing. We have seen a lot of interest from Turkish industries to relocate into Egypt in order to use a base where all inputs are much cheaper than Turkey. So there is clearly an economic gain here to be made by both sides. So I think that summarizes a little bit. There is a lot of economic interest, but there still is some, I think, mistrust on the politics. And I think that Turkey's impact and influence on Syria will take this into even more complicated grounds. But there is clearly a conscious thinking to try to keep the economic cooperation going on without interruption.
Thank you very much. We've been going for a little bit more than an hour, so I think we can wrap up.
Yes, I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Ziad Bahaa-Eldin, for your participation today. You have managed quite accurately to, you know, draw a picture of where Egypt is standing, especially in these tumultuous times, which is rather, you know, it's rather difficult to understand with all that has been going, the dynamics, the intentions, and the hardships. We really thank you for being here with us today, and hopefully we will see you again.
Surely we will see you again. We will see you again surely here in Athens.
Yes,
with pleasure.
I'm delighted to get know when you come back.
It was great.
And
it was
I will
great.
visit you for a let you know before I come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Have a nice night.
Have a nice.
All the best.
Bye. Bye.